Hey y'all, it's me Sydney and welcome back to Planet Sid. So today we are going to be talking about homoeroticism and hypermasculine spaces with a dash of homophobia and just hypermasculinity and everything else. So I really hope you guys enjoy this video. And before we get into it, I just want to thank you guys so much. I think I have like 200 subscribers now. So thank you guys so much for joining the community. And yeah, let's get into it. So if you've kept up with pop culture and current events, then you probably have subconsciously observed something that you can't quite put your finger on. And that thing would be homoeroticism in hypermasculine spaces. This could be if you're watching a football game, at a rapper's concert, a wrestling match, and you can bet your bottom dollar that when you're observing these things, you may also have observed some hypermasculinity with a dash of homophobia. So I started to think, why do these straight cisgendered men in these hypermasculine yet homoerotic spaces feel the need to reaffirm their masculinity and straightness and demean anything that isn't? And I want to make it clear that I am not speculating on anyone's sexuality. I think it's inappropriate and I think it's unnecessary anyways. But I do find it interesting how presumably straight cisgendered men who are considered the pinnacle of masculinity due to whatever field they're in, that they are so obsessed with reaffirming their sexuality and their masculinity and straightness in response to other men who are just comfortable expressing themselves outside of the straight cisgender norm. So that is what we're going to talk about today, folks. So let's get into it. So before we get into it, I do want to define what is homoeroticism and hypermasculinity, and then I also want to explore how I think these two are related. So Wikipedia would define homoeroticism as, quote, the sexual attraction between members of the same sex, either male-male or female-female. The concept differs from the concept of homosexuality. It refers specifically to the desire itself, which can be temporary, whereas homosexuality implies a more permanent state of identity or sexual orientation, end quote. And Google would define hypermasculinity as, quote, a psychological and sociological term for the exaggeration of male stereotypical behavior, such as an emphasis on physical strength, aggression, and human male sexuality, end quote. And these aren't new concepts, but I haven't really heard anyone talk about how homoerotic hypermasculine spaces are, and maybe that being a reason why homophobia exists specifically in these spaces. And I want to reiterate that homophobia exists anywhere because people are homophobic and hateful. I wonder if one of the reasons why homophobia exists so much more prevalently in spaces like sports and hip hop, for example, is because there's this subtle homoeroticism that exists only in these spaces, which there's nothing wrong with, but because these spaces rely so heavily on outdated ideas and behaviors surrounding masculinity, a lot of these men feel threatened by the possible existence of a spectrum of sexuality, because that means that they'll be on it as well. And so maybe some of these cisgendered straight men feel homoerotic feelings, which is nothing more than a temporary attraction to someone of the same sex. But maybe on a subconscious level or consciously, they could feel that maybe it goes against what their version of masculinity is, which is ridiculous. But instead of sitting with these feelings and exploring what that means to them, they rather shame and demean others. Specifically, they rather shame and demean other gay men who have liberated themselves from the shackles of hypermasculinity. Also, generally, cisgendered straight men have a very binary way of thinking when it comes to sexuality and sexual orientation, especially when it's in reference to another man's sexual orientation. And so, yeah, so now since we've discussed homoeroticism and hypermasculinity, I want to give you guys some examples so we can really dive in deep. Now I want to go over the homoeroticism and the anti-gay agenda in pop culture. Because they're always talking about the gay agenda, which obviously is ridiculous. But there really is an anti-gay agenda, especially since there's so many more gay people that are taking center stage now. I feel like there are a lot more people who feel the need to defend their straight spaces, which is fucking ridiculous. Now, I feel like we can't talk about homoeroticism and hypermasculinity in pop culture without discussing sports and hip hop. So let's start with sports, because American sports have a very homoerotic history, which I didn't even know about. So if you don't know, a lot of American sports are inspired or derived from Greek sports in ancient Greece. So think of American football, which derived from soccer, which originated from episkiros, which is a Greek ball game, and also modern day track and field and wrestling as well. They all trace back to ancient Greece as well, which is really cool. And I'm only mentioning this because back in ancient Greece, these sports were somewhat homoerotic in two different ways. So if you don't know, when these Greek men were playing these sports, they were all oiled up and they were also nude. And I did see a few theories on why they were covered in oil and naked for sports in ancient Greece. But on Taste of History, they believed that the men were trained and competed naked to appear before the Greek god Zeus, who the Olympic Games are dedicated to. Which isn't far-fetched because good health and aesthetics were held in the same regard as philosophy and law in ancient Greece. And so many other historians believe that men covered their naked bodies in oil when training and competing to use it as sunblock and to block dirt and oils from getting into their pores. And since oil can be very messy, and back then they didn't have too many clothes, like that would be very messy, so they just saved themselves the mess. And that's why, at least one of the theories why, they covered themselves in oil and were naked, or because they wanted to appear before Zeus in their best possible way. And during these times in ancient Greece, only men were playing sports and were allowed in the gymnasium. So it really wasn't like too big of a thing to where they needed to be embarrassed in front of other women or anything. But that's a little Greek history, but it was homoerotic nonetheless. A bunch of oiled up naked men, bumping and grinding. I don't want to say bumping and grinding, but well, if you're running around a field, chasing each other, whatever, they're oiled and they're naked. But obviously, I wasn't there in ancient Greece and I'm none of these men, so I don't know if they felt any temporary attraction towards one another. But I do have eyes and I see that the imagery is very homoerotic. They were literally naked and oily and conventionally attractive men who were basically rubbing up against one another and chasing each other around the field. So fast forward to present day, we have these men essentially doing the same things, but with the uniform and padding. And it doesn't just stop there. Just think, for example, anytime a player gets a goal or anything in American football or when playing soccer, it is customary for the other men to smack the player on the butt or something. Which again, there's nothing wrong with any of these actions. It's not that deep. There's nothing wrong with that. But with that, I do find it very interesting and odd that the US is ranked worst in a sports homophobia study in 2021. And the study is titled, quote unquote, Out in the Field. That's some good wordplay. And they found out that, quote, the first international study on homophobia in sports is a survey of nearly 9,500 people, mostly from 6 countries, the US, UK, Australia, Canada, Ireland, and New Zealand. And so the researchers found that 80% of all participants and 82% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual participants said that they have witnessed or experienced homophobia in sports. Of those reporting personal experience with homophobia, 84% of gay men and 82% of lesbians said that they felt they had received verbal slurs like the F word that rhymes with maggot and the D word that rhymes with Mike. Also, 81% of gay men and 74% of lesbians who were under 22 at the time of the study reported being completely or partially in the closet to teammates while playing youth sports. Nearly half of gay men and 32% of lesbians hid their sexuality while playing youth sports because they feared rejection by teammates. Only 1% of all participants believed LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual people were completely accepted in sports cultures. Only 1%. And 78% said that an openly gay, lesbian, or bisexual person would not be very safe as a spectator at a sporting event. The study found that the US had the highest percentage of gay men reporting that they had received verbal threats in a sports environment and the highest percentage of gay men who heard slurs. In fact, of the 6 countries surveyed, the US ranked worst in sports homophobia and discrimination, as measured by the quote-unquote inclusion score developed by the researchers. And Canada apparently had the highest score, followed by Australia, New Zealand, then the UK. And then Ireland, and then the US was last, of course. And they said that, quote, it is sad that the US fared so poorly, said Pat Griffin, who is the professor in social justice education at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and she is also a member of the academic team that advised the study authors. And she says that, quote, "It feels that we have made a lot of progress with the acceptance of homosexuality in sports, but going by the results, we have way long to go." And I just thought that was such an interesting study, especially in relation to this topic, because as of today, there have been less than 5 openly gay players in American sports. And I'm saying this because these men who spew so much hate and homophobia towards the LGBTQ community do it as if their straightness and heterosexuality are like under fire when they are still very much the majority. And even if they were becoming the minority, oh well, it doesn't justify you being hateful. And let's just say, hypothetically, even if heterosexuality was no longer the norm, why is it such a terrible thing, and why does that scare so many straight cisgendered men? But before we explore that, I want to focus on another section of pop culture that is very homoerotic in my opinion, and also very homophobic as well. And that would be hip hop. So hip hop as a whole is relatively quiet when it comes to calling out homophobia and transphobia, and also generally doesn't openly support any openly gay artists. For example, I Love Mackinnon, I think that's his name. It's the dude who made like the Going Up on a Tuesday song. He came out as openly gay. And then Lil Nas X, who is obviously very, very popular, but he has been the target of a lot of hate as well from people within the hip hop community. And this is still a very prominent issue because even within the past 2 years, D-list rappers have felt emboldened and empowered enough to go on homophobic rants and to have others from the industry support their ignorance. And I am talking about no other than the despicable human being, DaBaby. So in an article with The Daily Beast, editor Tiraka Love addresses this relationship between homoeroticism and homophobia. Quote, "Why do hip-hop artists who know they have queer fans unload these hate-filled diatribes against them whenever anything remotely gay happens or at random? And what does this manner in which artists go about depicting queerness say about them and their experiences?" Take DaBaby, who performed at Rolling Loud last month. This was wrote after DaBaby kind of had his meltdown on stage. Like, I don't fucking know what that was. I don't support him. But take DaBaby, who performed at Rolling Loud last month, and in addition to inviting Tory Lanez on stage, launched into a homophobic rant. And then she begins to describe this incredibly homophobic rant that he went on and says, which I'm not going to quote, it was very hateful, but if you know what I'm talking about, then you know what I'm talking about, and it doesn't really take you can Google it. And then she goes on to say, quote, "Obviously, the belief that HIV and AIDS make queer people dirty has a long racist and homophobic history." But in a less headline-ready statement, DaBaby also claimed to have observed a queer man reveling in his set. And then DaBaby said that, quote, "My boy on the left stage," she said, referring to an assumingly queer man who snapped a ton of vids of the set. And then he goes on to say, quote, "My boy had the crop top on, front row, he out there in that jungle, in that water," end quote. He explained, softly rubbing his chest at the word water. And then he goes, quote, "He out there standing on the rails, out there cutting up," end quote. And then she goes on to say that the body language here is aggressive. He follows up by saying this man knew all the words and was, quote, "rapping them bitches at him," end quote, and oddly soft. So the editor goes on to say that this dichotomy can be found elsewhere in DaBaby's over. I hope I said that word right. And then she goes on to describe that when DaBaby and BRS Cash ski down the Steven slopes in the Throw Baby remix video, a song that could be read as pushing a male-centered power dynamic against a woman, actually features 2 men frolicking in seminal fluid. And then she goes on to say, yes, it's a silly sexist joke, but there is undoubtedly subtle homoeroticism at play, end quote. And she knew what the fuck she was talking about. And then she starts to discuss Tyler, the Creator, who has had a questionable past in reference to the wildly homophobic things he used to say, but he does now identify as queer and as an ally, and he is also challenging the status quo of straightness and hypermasculinity in hip-hop. And I'm also a fan of Tyler, the Creator. Call me if you get lost. Love that. But then she also talks about how she says that, quote, "Tyler took this stick of challenging heteronormativity and or just queer baiting a step further in 2019 when he showed up on Funk Master Flex radio show and dropped a flirtatious freestyle that let Flex flummox."
Me and Flex looking in the index just for some hot butt sex.
And then she says that Tyler, the creator, in his freestyle, he says that, quote, me and Flex looking in the index just for some buff net niggas / for some hot butt sex, end quote. So that's what Tyler, the creator, said. And then she says that, quote, in the 7-minute flow that was performance art, as Flex once distanced himself by saying, pause, and questioning, now why you gotta say that?
What made you go with that verse?
While simultaneously grinning hard at Tyler's advances. It was a wonderfully awkward moment that showcases the way that desire and attraction from queer people speaks to the very existence of a spectrum that violent straightness seeks to destroy, end quote. And then so she further elaborates on how homophobic rappers in hip-hop want them to be gay privately, which is still terrible. And the thing is, like, with a lot of these homophobic rappers, especially like the people who are considered like the old heads and the legends, they say wildly homophobic shit, but then they'll rebuttal by saying, like, I don't think there's anything wrong with being gay, but then they'll kind of sort of say, like, you can be gay, but just be gay privately, which is still ridiculous, and that's just fucking terrible to say to anybody. But I find it so perplexing that these men show up in their profession cloaked in hypermasculinity, but they still engage in these homoerotic behaviors. And they're obsessed with somebody else's sexuality. And then the editor, for example, she continues and says that, quote, they want to police queerness while actively participating in a genre that trades in homoerotic spectacle. Just look at hip-hop magazines and music videos in 2010. A masked, flexed out 50 Cent pose behind a young, shirtless Soulja Boy on the cover of XXL magazine. His arm swung over Soulja's shoulder. A number of other rappers like LL Cool J, Tonelli have graced rap magazine covers shirtless, their pecs dripping with oil, like the football players. Make no mistake, this performative masculinity is not just for women. So it adds insult to injury when these same men in these statements, lyrics, and aesthetics then turn around and malign queerness. This isn't exclusive to hip-hop, of course. Homophobia and racism are cousins of the white supremacist family tree. And then she goes on to say that eugenicists like R.W. Shufield, who wrote 1950 America's Greatest Problem, the Negro also preached queer inferiority. As Hugh Ryan, author of the book When Brooklyn Was Queer, wrote in the Washington Post, Shufield was researching queerness, quote, which he variously referred to as passive pedestry, inversion, and perversion. Shufield, according to Ryan, quote, didn't believe that someone's sexual nature could be changed, end quote, but he, quote, did believe that we could prevent queer people by closely policing homosexuality, end quote. And then the editor goes on to say that unfortunately Hot 97 and Power 105.1, Boosie, the Baby, and a host of others are willing to carry the torch to police queerness into oblivion and self-hatred, while at the same time profiting directly from homoeroticism, which, I mean, literally, just look at the materials. Look at the materials. And she goes on to say that at the end of his Summer Jam set, the Baby performed Pop Smoke's, quote, Thief in the Night, which is honoring the slain rapper. If you don't know, Pop Smoke he was killed. And just after the performance, the artist walked into the middle of the stadium and with men's and women's hands reaching out to the rapper, he shouted out, do y'all mind if I take my shirt off, Summer Jam? The Baby said this. And then so he then, of course, removed his tight black sling shirt to roars from the crowd. Everybody was reveling in his sweaty body, and then he dived into his smash hit Suge, and the crowd writhed in ecstasy. I thought that was an excellent article, and she really captured just the homoeroticism and also just the hypocrisy and the lack of self-awareness as well. But I'm not done, because homoeroticism and homophobia has had its place in hip-hop for far too long. I feel like this is something that people have observed, but they haven't quite been able to put a name to it. And so since we're talking about rappers who are lyricists, we cannot not talk about language. And what I mean by this is every rapper's favorite line in 2009, which is quote unquote no homo. Interestingly enough, the rapper who allegedly coined this term was Cameron. Some people say it was Joel Santana of Dipset, but other people say it was Cameron from his song Silky and then No Homo. And I find it interesting that allegedly he's the one who coined this term, because his most iconic look And when you think of Cameron, you think of him in that big ass pink furry coat with the hat, headband, whatever it is, and just like him draped in pink, which is nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's a color. People associate that color with femininity. And furthermore, when rappers use the phrase no homo, it's always used as like somewhat of a disclaimer or a double entendre that could potentially be interpreted as them saying something alluding to liking other men. And so they basically have to say like, no, that's not me, instead of just letting the wordplay just be wordplay. And I find it so interesting because it's only straight cisgender men who do that thing where they go out of their way to distance themselves from gayness, almost as if being gay is the worst possible thing you could be as a man, especially in hip hop where, like, I don't know, you could be a abuser, a rapist, a killer, like literally anything, but they make it seem like being gay is just the absolute fucking worst. And the thing that I find most ironic about homophobia in hypermasculine spaces, like sports and hip hop, for example, is that they almost always express themselves in a way that would be considered homoerotic. And this could be as simple as sweaty men chasing and colliding with each other around a field, a wrestler pinning another man's leg above his head, or even two rappers posing on a magazine cover, shirtless and sweaty, covered in oil. And I just don't get the obsession that these super quote-unquote macho masculine men have with other gay men, whether that be how they express themselves or how they have sex or how much space they take up in their industry. And I don't understand why these straight cisgender men feel the need to express that they are so anti-gay, especially when nobody's even talking about gay people. Literally the baby. You can just perform your songs. Like, I don't get it. And even outside of that, like, even with the whole no homo thing, like, you're making a song and you still feel the need to reiterate that you're not gay. I did come across this article about the anti-gay agenda. It was an op-ed with the New York Times, and the editor was Charles M. Blow. And he referenced a James Baldwin interview with the Village Voice in 1984. And James Baldwin said that, quote, macho men are far more complex than they want to realize. And Baldwin said that they, quote, have needs which for them are literally inexpressible. They don't dare to look in the mirror. And that is why they need the F word that rhymes with maggots. They created the F word in order to act out a sexual fantasy on the body of another man and not take any responsibility for it, end quote. And then so in this op-ed, Charles goes on to say that, in other words, some homophobes outwardly attack that which they inwardly battle. And then he goes on to give a disclaimer that in the case of these rappers, he accepts their identities at face value and doesn't want to apply anything to the contrary. That's their business, not mine. And then he goes, see how that works, fellas. And yeah, I have to agree. Like, again, I want to reiterate that I am not speculating on anyone's sexuality. I could care less. It's none of my business. If you say that you're straight, then you're straight. Like, I don't really care. But then the editor, Charles, goes on to say that, but there's another idea that Baldwin expressed in that interview that I think is even more important to explore. That, quote, the sexual question and the racial question have always been intertwined. And then he says that so many things about this observation ring true. I have always contended that of all the isms and phobias are cousins, that in a society that creates a hierarchy of humanity with straight, white, cisgendered men at the apex, every person who is not white or straight or cisgendered or male gets assigned a lower order of being. In that sense, racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia all branch from the same tree, and one bias can influence and amplify another. He then goes on to say, in a society that treats racism as a sport in which each racial group is jockeying against the others, all of them shadowed by a culture of white supremacy laced with misogyny, anything that reduces your percentage of straight males or quote-unquote feminizes them is seen as weakening the race. Gay Black people become agents against Black power and Black liberation. A weight on the race. When this fraudulent thesis is adopted, interracial terror picks up where interracial terror left off. It is not the gay Black person who becomes an instrument of white supremacist attack on Black masculinity. It is the Black homophobe who becomes the instrument of oppression against his own brethren. And it is important to point out that the racist and the homophobe often employ the same tactics. Last week, I wrote about how white supremacists use the defense of children as a way of attempting to render their hatred honorable. Homophobes often use the same tactic, claiming that they are protecting children from exposure, that precisely the defense Boosie Badass used when appearing on the Breakfast Club radio show. At one point, seemingly expressing a fear that if rappers did not speak out against certain expressions of gayness, an entire generation of children would be indoctrinated. Once again, to clarify, there is no amount of exposure that can make straight men prefer a penis or gay one prefer a vagina. If that were true, with all the straight love and affection that gay kids are exposed to, they would be turned straight by the age of 5. Sexual attraction and sexuality just don't work like that. What this simplistic notion of sexuality admits is that there are also gay children who have known that they were different for as long as they have remembered. And those children deserve representation and visibility. They need to know that there is nothing wrong, broken, or evil about them, so that they too can feel normal and seen. The absence of that feeling has led to too many self-destructive behaviors, including suicide. Racists will also point to their friends of color as evidence that they are not racist themselves. Donald Trump's defenders also pointed out that he had black friends, or at least associates, in hip-hop before he ran for president. This is the same kind of defense that homophobes often use. Boosie introduced the world to his gay manager in an Instagram post in an attempt to demonstrate that he cannot be homophobic. Wrong. You can be racist with black friends and homophobic with gay friends. I have 2 things to say to black male homophobes. 1, stop doing the work of the white supremacist patriarchy and fighting against the people you should be fighting for and with. 2, men who are secure don't care one bit about what gay people are doing behind closed doors. Not only does gayness have nothing to do with them, but the evolutionary biology level, it also eliminates competitors from the heterosexual competition for mates. Be more like those men if that is truly your truth. End quote. And I just thought, I had to read the whole article because I just thought that entire article, Charles just did such a good job with just really pinpointing on how ridiculous and how harmful and hateful the anti-gay agenda is. But I also thought it was interesting how he pointed out that how literally everything, including homophobia, all traces back to white supremacy and this superior mindset to think that anything outside of the norm is a threat to them being a majority. So then they kind of go on this campaign of erasure of an entire community because they feel uncomfortable with the truth that gay people are more visible than they have ever been. Then that includes hypermasculine spaces as well. All the while, these hypermasculine men engage in these homoerotic behaviors, whether they know it consciously or not. But why do these presumably straight, cisgendered men who engage in homoerotic behaviors for a living have so much to say about gay and trans people who, by the way, aren't checking for them either? I'll tell you why. It's because of heteronormativity. So now that we've discussed pop culture, I do want to pivot and discuss heteronormativity and hegemonic masculinity. So Google would define heteronormativity as, quote, denoting or relating to a worldview that promotes heterosexuality as a normal or preferred sexual orientation, end quote. And Google would define hegemonic masculinity as, quote, a practice that legitimizes men's dominant position in society and justifies the subordination of the common male population and women in other marginalized ways of being a man, end quote. And I think that this is important because a lot of times these men in these hypermasculine spaces are kind of like a hybrid of hypermasculinity, heteronormativity, and hegemonic masculinity. And I feel that the root of all this toxicity is the need to perform and protect what they feel a stereotypical man is. It's like they're protecting this illusion of the gender binary and in a way promoting gender performance. Because in my opinion, masculinity is nothing more than a performance, which is nothing good or bad. Like, it's nothing inherently wrong with that. But masculinity can be performed in various mediums like aesthetics, mannerisms, beliefs, or language. And I say this because there's this homoerotic language that a lot of men use when talking to one another. For example, it's very common for men to insult one another by saying, quote unquote, suck my dick. And I saw somebody talked about this in an article called The Ironic Erotic in the Michigan Daily. And so the editor, Karis Clark, says that, quote, it is ironic that the subtext of many straight male bonding activities is exquisitely erotic. Jungian psychotherapist Thomas More ascribes our bodies as imaginative, mythical and mythological erotic landscapes. He says that, quote, our penchant for literalism hinders us from seeing the inherent homosociality in male-dominated endeavors of contact sports, video gaming, working out, pre-going out rituals, nightlife, Greek life, the military, and gang activities. And then he goes on to quote Black womanist Audre Lorde. She described that the erotic can be viewed as, quote, providing the power which comes from sharing deeply any pursuit with another person, end quote. And when considering the notions of Moore and Lorde in tandem, it becomes clear that much of male homosociality is simultaneously homoerotic. And then he goes on to specify that that's not to be confused with homosexuality because those are two different things. And then he goes on to say that sports and video games simulate, physically or virtually, a breaking of societal norms and behaviors through their systemic brutality. And then he goes on to say that we interact in ways in which we normally wouldn't in sports and video games here. And act, that's the key word here. The performance of masculinity that many straight men act out is characterized by what sociology scholar David Grazian describes as, quote, relentless competitive spirit, distant emotional detachment, and insatiable heterosexual desire, all commonly displayed by the sexual objectification of women, end quote. And then he goes on to say that Grazian likens the male affairs of nightlife as the homosocial, quote-unquote, girl hunting ritual rife with rivalry. He makes the claim that pre-gaming, which often occurs along gender lines, involves an indulgence in drinking, drugs, and party music, which maintains in fast lanes confidence and courage for the night ahead. In the animalistic world of mating and dating, Grazian proclaims that males' peers remain the quote-unquote intended audience for their performance, with sexual encounters as events of the ego. Paradoxically, many men objectify women, not just for pleasure, but in order to gain high standing and status, high ranking and reputation among each other, which we all know. Like, men do a lot of things for male validation as well. It's not just women. And then he goes on to say, and the post-gaming cool-down, rundown, and discourses of the night between male friends only furthers this phenomenon. The feminist theorist Marilyn Frye explains in, quote, The Politics of Reality, all or almost all of that which pertains to love, most straight men reserve exclusively for other men. The people whose respect, admiration, recognition, reverence, and love they desire, those are overwhelmingly other men. Then she goes on to say that from women, they want devotion, service, and sex. The favorite actors and musicians, athletes, and politicians of straight men remain majority male. Ironically, straight men seek approval from other straight men as well, all the while avoiding actual intimacy. And then Casey goes on to claim that paradoxically, the embodied desire for heteronormativity depends upon homosocial relationships that in turn often manifest homoerotic and even homosexual desires and behaviors. So in other words, constructing a male-centered society built on rigid gender binaries and hegemonic masculinity, heterosexual men have inadvertently subjugated themselves into segregated same-sex spaces, all of which hold ambiguously erotic orientations. And then he goes on to clarify again that this is not to suggest that straight men are repressed homosexuals, but quite the contrary. Such spaces simultaneously create what gender scholars Niels Himmerin and Thomas Johansson refer to as, quote, straight panic, in which individuals experience anxieties about how others perceive their sexuality, and thus feel a need to confirm their heterosexuality. Inevitably, heterosexuality requires homophobia. And psychology scholar Gregory Herrick asserts that hegemonic masculinity is in part determined by what it is not. That is, not feminine and not homosexual. It is not enough to be not gay. One must be anti-gay as a means to maintaining and reaffirming one's status as a heterosexual. Likewise, sexuality scholar Jay Clarkson claims that, quote, even the most masculine gay man's homosexuality denies him the ability to truly achieve the power inherent to hegemonic masculinity, no matter how masculine the gender performance, because he will always be marginalized simply because he is not heterosexual. And this is very off topic, but when he made the connection between video games and homoeroticism, it literally made me think of like that Black Mirror episode. Like, if you know, then you know. Also, Nicole Bahari needs like an entire Oscar. But yeah, both of them, they're married and presumably straight. I don't think they ever like defined their sexuality, because it's been like over 3 years since I've seen that episode. I would have to rewatch it, but it literally made me think of like that episode from Black Mirror, where it was like the video game and like those two married best friends who each had wives and like a whole lives at home. Maybe he was gay, I don't know, but they were two men, and then they'll play the game and like make love in the game. Like, I don't know. It's just so crazy how like a lot of just like quote unquote male bonding activities kind of do have like a subtle homoeroticism at play, which isn't a terrible thing, but I just think that that's so interesting, because I'm not saying that women don't have that, because I guess if I thought hard enough about it, I could find something. But it's insane how men specifically feel the need to reaffirm their straightness in a way that no other group has, in a way that no other group feels the need to, while also like in their everyday life, like whether they're playing video games or playing sports or anything, is always somewhat homoerotic. I just think that that's so interesting. I'm gonna rewatch that Black Mirror episode, and I think you should too. If you know what, like, if you watch Black Mirror, then you know what episode I'm talking about. I think it was off the last season, but anyways. Back to the topic at hand, I want to talk about the militarization of masculinity, because I feel like with all of these like super like manosphere alpha male like dudes, like, because they're all like it's like the alpha males and like the terrible fucking homophobic rappers and like the shitty ass politicians, like all those people, like they're all kind of like the same, but they, in a way, like with all their followers, it kind of almost becomes like a militarized like militia, like just in the way of like how they, I guess, recycle their hateful ideologies and how people just eat it up. The thing with hypermasculinity, toxic masculinity, and any other term that'll fall under that umbrella is that they all kind of exist within their own worlds, but they all have similar structures. Like, they all have like the same kind of hierarchical structure. So, for example, think about the manosphere, the military, podcasts, rappers, and sports. These all have specific leaders who set the tone for the rest to follow. So the relationship between somebody like Andrew Tate and his loyal followers, or podcasters and their audiences, or rappers and their fans, or high-ranking officials and their subordinates, whatever these men say and do, no matter how egregious it is demeaning to others, including their followers, they will always have people who are eager to support them because they want to be like them. So since we're kind of on the topic of like the militarization, I do want to talk about the military. The military is also somewhat homoerotic. I mean, I don't support the military. I support the individuals, but I don't support the military as an organization. I did see this research paper that kind of researched like the homoeroticism that exists in the military, and it's titled "The Tension of Brotherhood," which, ooh, I like that. It's titled "The Brotherhood of Tension," and it was written by Juliet Cross. And basically, in this research paper, she talks about how intrinsic these outdated ideas about masculinity are to the brotherhood in the military. And they also engage in homosocial and homoerotic behaviors as well, and in turn making it even worse for gay men in the military setting. So she goes on to write that, quote, "The military has been portrayed as a brotherhood long before national armies came to stand as they are now. The idea that unit cohesion strengthens the brotherhood has remained strongly present and deemed crucial within preparation for combat. The identity of the brotherhood rests upon norms of traditionalized masculinity, strength, and unemotional nature, fearlessness, to name a few, and simultaneously cast those deemed as quote-unquote feminine as incompatible with the military, on the basis that the individuals would disrupt this important social cohesion. However, while arguing the incompatibility of feminized individuals such as gay or queer men in the military itself engages in behaviors that is considered homosocial and homoerotic or otherwise feminized. Unlike if these behaviors were practiced by those feminized, the brotherhood enacting them is accepted and the acts themselves are appropriated into the masculine identity of the military." And then she then goes on to say that, quote, Accounts of homoeroticism often portray these acts as disassociated from homosexuality. Homoerotic acts are not inherently linked to sexual identity and instead are argued as sexual acts without desire or feelings attached, and that is platonic sexual acts. And these range from intimate bodily experiences to fulfillment of sexual urges, from living in close quarters to rituals of celebration, to hazing that involve nudity or simulation of sexual acts. And she goes on to say that feminized behaviors are also those that aren't homosocial or homoerotic in kind, but instead are those in which the male participates in activities, obligatory or not, that places them in a position that is constructed as feminine. And she goes on to say that this includes being forced to obey orders by superiors, undertaking tasks coded as feminine, such as cleaning or working on appearance, or general acts of objectification. It is important to emphasize that these behaviors described are not themselves inherently quote-unquote feminine, but are coded as such into a patriarchal society, justifying my use in the hierarchical opposition of the typical masculine norms and socially constructed that correspond to militarized settings, end quote. And the thing that I find so interesting about all the different facets of hypermasculinity is that these men want to observe and uphold what their idea of a man is, as if anything outside of what they think a masculine man is a threat. And because a lot of times these men are so anti anything that isn't super macho and masculine, and they are also in these high status positions as well, and these positions are what other people believe to be quote unquote masculine, these men are able to spew hate and ignorance and homophobia to their audiences of loyal followers, and then their followers in turn do the same thing. And this applies to fans, followers, subordinates, sons, and anyone else you could think of. And I'm saying this because when hypermasculine men are recycling these hateful ideologies, in a way they're kind of militarizing masculinity. And this not only applies to rappers and athletes, but to high-ranking officials in the military as well. And the infestation of podcast dudes, people like Andrew Tate, and so on and so forth. And mind you, these different groups of people all have varying degrees of homoeroticism that I still find so interesting. But these leaders also have very rigid ideas of manhood and masculinity that they kind of force their followers to live up to. They demean anyone who isn't living up to their idea of masculinity as well. And they do it by saying that if they aren't what they believe is masculine, then they aren't real men. They aren't respectable, they'll be broke forever, and they won't have any upward mobility in any area of their lives. And they also preach this false narrative that you have to check all these boxes. So when these men who have been sold these false ideas of manhood see these other men who are unapologetically themselves and liberated, it makes me wonder if that's where the homoeroticism and homophobia and just vitriol gets exasperated. And this makes me think of a video that I did quite a while ago on cringe culture. And basically in that video, I talked about how cringe culture is nothing more than a projection of contempt. If you guys haven't watched it, then I think you really should. It's a really good video, if I say so myself. But basically, I talk about how cringe culture is nothing more than a projection of contempt. And because basically they're feeling contempt because when they see somebody doing something that's quote unquote cringy, people either feel some form of adoration because they'll think like, oh, like, wow, I wish I could do that. Or they feel like some kind of disdain or contempt because they see somebody doing something that maybe they didn't have the guts to do. And so they rather call it quote unquote cringy and project those negative feelings onto others who have the courage to be authentically themselves, whether or not if they like their content or whatever. So with that being said, in the context of hypermasculinity and homoeroticism, I don't think it's far-fetched to theorize that alpha males feel some sort of attraction to other men who don't subscribe to their same ideas of masculinity. And I'm not talking about romantic or sexual attraction at all. I'm simply talking about the attraction to the liberation. Attraction that only someone can feel towards another person who just shows up in the world as authentically themselves, even if that means they possibly won't be accepted by the majority. And it's the liberation that I think that these men find so triggering but attractive, whether they consciously or subconsciously know it. And so with this attraction and I guess somewhat adoration up under all that, which they may not even consciously be feeling, they rather recycle destructive ideas about masculinity than look inward and ask themselves why they are feeling a certain way. and why they are so bothered by the existence of others who simply live a different life. So in turn, they just assemble groups of terrible men and they just prey on the next vulnerable victims instead of self-reflect, which is terrible. I don't think it takes much to look inward and just like look around and read the room and see like it's kind of homoerotic and there's nothing wrong with that, but just acknowledge the spectrum of sexuality and acknowledge that you're probably on that as well. And you can still be a straight male or a straight woman or whatever. And so it's no reason to hate people for the way that they were born. It's no reason for that. And it's nothing more than a projection of whatever feelings you may be feeling. So I don't know, like get help. I don't know. Journal. I don't know, girl, but yeah, this is the end of the video. I really hope you guys enjoyed this discussion and this dialogue. I'm really interested to see what you guys think about this idea of homoeroticism in hypermasculine spaces. So let me know what you guys think. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to check out my clothing brand, Main Character The Label, and my makeup brand, Box Office Beauty. And yeah, I hope you guys feel safe and sane wherever you are. And I hope you guys are finding joy and fulfillment on your journey of self-expression. Until next time.